and welcome to the Wilderness for the Mind live event. I'm going to tonight be talking to Adam Zeman, a professor from Exeter University, about nature, the mind and visual imagination. Adam specialises in looking at the mind's eye, so he's going to be talking with us about how the creative brain works. Adam, would you start by talking a little bit about your research?
Certainly. So my name is Adam Zeman. I'm Professor of Cognitive and Behavioural Neurology at the University of Exeter. And for the past few years, I've been fascinated by the eye's mind, as we've called it in our project, which really to trip people up. The mind's eye is a very familiar phrase. And working with a group, a collaborative group, including an art historian and a philosopher and an artist and a neuroscientist, we've been looking at aspects of the visual imagination. We had a look at the history of thinking about visual imagery, because people have been thinking about this since Plato and Aristotle. We pulled together what is known about what happens in the brain when we visualize, and have written a paper containing a meta-analysis of all the data that exists on that topic. And then more recently, over the last few years, I've been particularly interested in people who lie at the extremes of the visual imagery vividness spectrum. That's to say, people with who lack imagery entirely, with aphantasia, and people who have particularly vivid imagery, hyperphantasia. I think we'll be coming back to them.
Great, thank you. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how visual imagination works in the brain.
Yeah, so it's clear that, like most psychological capacities, visualization, the ability to see things in the mind's eye, depends on a network of regions in the brain, not on a single region, but on a distributed network. And this fly-through is showing you, slice by slice, regions in the brain that become active when you visualize. And to cut rather a long story short, a number of kinds of area are involved. So regions that become active when you look at the world are involved. So parts of the visual cortex or visual cortices, which lie towards the back of the brain. But there are also areas involved in memory become active, because if I ask you to visualize your front door or an apple, you have to remember what an apple or your front door looks like, and then use that visual memory to feed your visual imagination. And areas which are involved in what one might call cognitive control are also involved. So if you decide to visualize an apple, you have to make a decision to do so, focus your attention, direct your mental energies towards undertaking that task. So a combination of visual areas, memory-related areas, and decision-making areas become active in the brain when we visualize.
Great, thank you. And so could you, could you just talk a little bit about the difference between when we see with our eyes and when we see in our minds?
Yeah. So it turns out that visualization is a kind of echo of perception, if you like. Visualization is a kind of echo of vision. And areas which are active when you look become active when you visualize. And what this slide shows is brain activity in someone who is looking at and then visualizing faces. And it is homing in on areas which are particularly strongly activated by faces. So on the left of the screen, under perception, when you look at a face, three named areas become active. The fusiform gyrus, which contains an area that's very important in facial recognition. So if that area of the brain is damaged, it becomes hard to recognize faces. The amygdala, which is an area involved in reading facial emotion. And the STS, the superior temporal sulcus, which is another region of the cortex that is involved in reading facial expressions. And the interest in this slide is that those areas are clearly activated when you look at faces. But if you look to the right under imagery, you'll see that those areas also become active, though less strongly, when you simply visualize a face. You imagine the face of your partner or child or parent. Areas which are active in the seeing brain become active in the visualizing brain.
Great, thank you. And so, yeah, which parts of the brain are being activated in terms of spatially, whereabouts?
So spatially, the visual areas lie towards the back of the brain. So there's an area called the primary visual cortex, area V1, which lies right at the back of the brain, which curiously is the first area to be activated by input coming from the eyes and then traveling through the brain. And surrounding V1, there are about 30 to 40 other areas, all of which play a part in processing visual input, processing it with respect to the analysis of shape and color and movement, and ultimately allowing us to recognize things. So those are the visual cortices. What this slide shows you is that one respect in which visualization differs to perception is that when we visualize as the result of a request to visualize an apple or one's front door, one's performing a kind of deliberate act, and that involves decision-making areas that focus our attention, which lie more towards the front of the brain. So if you look at the top right-hand corner, you'll see that there are areas right at the front of the brain that are becoming active in a visualization task, which wouldn't be so active when we're simply looking at the world. It's not true to say that vision is an entirely passive process. I mean, on the contrary, there's plenty of evidence now that when we look at the world, we kind of go after knowledge. We're constantly making predictions about what we're going to see next. We're using our eye movements and our visual attention to pull knowledge in. So vision itself isn't an entirely passive process, but visualization is a highly active process because it involves decision-making and attentional focus of a kind that vision doesn't usually require.
Thank you. And in terms of the study, I understand you've been looking at a kind of spectrum of people from those that can imagine as clearly as seeing to those that really can't bring up mental images at will. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you found in those different groups.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So perhaps I should just say, by way of background, that there are a number of questionnaires which make it possible to assess the vividness of someone's visual imagery, at least subjectively. And the questionnaire we've used is called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire. It asks you to visualize 16 scenes and then to rate the vividness of the image you can summon up to your mind's eye. So for example, imagine the sun setting in a hazy sky. You try to do that, and then you decide whether your image is as vivid as real seeing, which would give you a score of 5 out of 5, or you're unable to form an image at all, you're just thinking about it, which would give you a score of 1 over 5. And the grades of vividness between give you scores of 2, 3, and 4. So 16 scenarios, 5, a maximum score of 5. The maximum score on the test is 80. The minimum score is 16. And the lower panel shows you that if you give this test to a population, in this case, I think of Exeter University undergraduates, you see a spread of scores from up towards 80 down into the 30s. Over in the top panel shows you a small group of people who appear to lack the ability to form images either partially or totally. So a number of those focus scoring 16 over 80, which is the lowest possible score on this test. Now, we felt that the inability to form an image in the mind's eye deserved a name. It hadn't been christened, if you like, even though it had been recognized from the late 19th century that there was a small number of people who were unable to call images to the mind's eye, whose powers of visualization were 0, as Francis Galton, the 19th century psychologist, put it, but no one had given it a name. So we christened it aphantasia, calling on Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, phantasia, and adding an A on at the end to denote the absence of that ability. So folk with aphantasia lack the ability to summon visual imagery to mind voluntarily, whereas people at the opposite end of the spectrum, scoring 80 over 80 or thereabouts, like you, I think, Claire, have what we call hyperphantasia, exceptionally vivid imagery. It's curious that very little attention had been paid to these extremes over the last 100 years or so. So Francis Galton had recognized that there were people who lacked imagery in the 1880s, but very little attention had been paid to that phenomenon since. And I guess that's the explanation for the fact that we've had about 14,000 people get in touch since we coined the term, most of them telling us about their inability to visualize.
That's really interesting. And I guess, yeah, so I should say that I have been involved in the study, and I went to Exeter and had my brain scanned, which was really interesting and quite claustrophobic experience. But maybe actually it would be helpful, because we've just seen the images of the slices through the brain, just to explain a little bit about what we're actually seeing there and how you perform those kind of brain scans.
Yeah, so we should have explained. The basic principle is that the brain is a little bit like a muscle. in the sense that when you use a particular region of brain for a task, blood flow to that region increases. And there are now a number of techniques that make it possible to visualize using technology that increase in blood flow. So the bright areas that I was showing you in the scans a moment ago were areas of the brain which had an increased blood flow because of increased demand for oxygen and glucose because they become more active.
Great, thank you. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you found from the study. So what are the differences in the ways that people with aphantasia, people with hyperphantasia, and somewhere in the middle visualize?
Yeah, so there seem to be some interesting associations between aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and some other psychological functions. So people with aphantasia quite often have difficulty in recognizing faces, interestingly. That wasn't a link which I would have predicted on theoretical grounds, because visualization is distinct from perception, and the ability to recognize faces is a perceptual ability, not an ability that one would have thought necessarily requires the ability to visualize. So that's curiosity, interesting association. It's not true of everyone with aphantasia, and indeed, I think aphantasia is a feature of experience which I think can occur in a number of different contexts. But there's one group of folk with aphantasia who have face recognition difficulty, about a third. There's another group, roughly a third, who complain that they have really rather poor autobiographical memory. And I guess that makes some intuitive sense, because if you recollect last year's summer holiday, the chances are that your recollection will have some visual content. For most people, visualization is quite an important element of autobiographical memory. So it makes some sense that if you can't visualize, it's more difficult to recollect autobiographical episodes, to relive them, to re-experience them. So those are two associations with aphantasia. At the other end of the spectrum, people with hyperphantasia appear to be more likely in our data to have synesthesia. That's the kind of merging of the senses that sometimes leads people to taste colors or see particular days of the week in particular colors when they look at the corresponding words for them. There are some interesting variations, just to mention briefly. So aphantasia can affect all the senses or just vision. So there are some folk who say they have no sensory imagery at all, no mind's ear, no mind's tongue, no mind's fingertip. But there's another group who say that this just affects vision and they have a perfectly vivid mind's ear, for example. So that's one interesting variation in the group of people with hyperphantasia. Another really interesting variation has to do with dreaming. So about a half of the people who've been in touch with us with aphantasia dream visually. So they know what imagery is like in the context of dreaming, even though they can't voluntarily summon imagery to the mind's eye during the day. So it's an interesting dissociation between dream imagery and wakeful imagery, whereas the other half also say that they lack imagery in dreams as well as wakefulness. The slide that you're showing at the moment is kind of the beginning of the story, if you like. So this MX was the first person I met who was unable to visualize, and he was actually exceptional in that he had imagery and then lost it in his 60s following a cardiac procedure. We don't know exactly why. Maybe he had a small stroke or something of that kind, but having previously had very vivid visual imagery, he found that he was no longer able to visualize. And that contrasts with the great majority of people with aphantasia who've been in touch with us who have lifelong absence of imagery. So much the commonest form is congenital or lifelong. Acquired aphantasia is relatively rare, but MX is an example. And for various reasons, his case was very intriguing, and we wanted to find out what was happening in his brain when he tried to visualize. And in this slide, you see what happens in his brain when he looks at famous faces. And you are seeing areas which are selectively active in relation to looking at faces. And the take-home message is that his brain looks pretty much like the control brains. And if you look down at the bottom image on the left under MX, you'll see that there are two bright areas, and those are his fusiform face areas. Those are the areas which I mentioned earlier, which are particularly crucial for face recognition. and he activates those perfectly normally when he looks at faces. And if you compare statistically the images on the right, which come from people who were the same age as NX and had the same IQ, you compare their images with NX's, there's no difference. So his brain activation when he looks at faces is perfectly normal, but when he tries to visualize faces, if you go to the next slide, the top two images show you areas that he's failing to activate. So he is underactivating or failing to activate visual areas which you or I would activate when we look at faces. And the images beneath show you that there are areas at the front of the brain which he's activating particularly strongly, perhaps because he's making an intense effort to visualize, or he's experiencing some sort of cognitive dissonance because he's finding the task difficult. So here we have a nice, what we call neural correlate for the change in his experience. We find that although he has normal brain activation when he looks at faces, and indeed he has normal experience when he looks at faces, when he tries to visualize them, which he can no longer do normally, he fails to activate those visual areas which you or I would. So we proposed that was the explanation for his acquired aphantasia. He could no longer activate those visual areas at will.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Really fascinating to hear about your research. And one of the things we'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about some of the artworks in the Wilderness for the Mind show, and some of the questions that have come up from our artists about their experience of the creative brain and their experience of connection with nature. Oh, actually, before we do that, one thing that you did look at is how aphantasia and hyperphantasia might impact the choices that you make, the way that you learn, and what kind of profession you might have.
Yeah, so I didn't mention this earlier, but this was another interesting finding from a questionnaire study which we conducted in 2,000 people with aphantasia and 200 with hyperphantasia. So it seems that having aphantasia biases you towards working in a scientific or mathematical or IT-related trade, whereas having hyperphantasia, having very vivid imagery, biases you towards working in what have generally been described as creative industries. That's what one might have guessed, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but interestingly, there are many exceptions to this rule. And one nice surprise from the research was that quite a large number of aphantasic artists and indeed authors and architects got in touch with us. So last year we organized an exhibition of aphantasic and hyperphantasic art. And the aphantasic and hyperphantasic artists give very different descriptions of their artistic process. But interestingly, I think it would be very difficult to diagnose aphantasia or hyperphantasia by looking at the work. So I think there may well be interesting subtle differences, but although the experience of artists with aphantasia and hyperphantasia is very different, and their working processes seem to be different, as I say, it would be hard to tell from the work itself.
Yeah, and actually one of my friends who was in both your study and in the exhibition that we had, he talked about his experience as an artist with aphantasia and how he used the canvas almost as a space to create his visual imagination. So he would, by trial and error, try and create figures and say, oh, wait a minute, no, this arm doesn't look quite right. Or
That's right.
Yeah, so
I mean, as a colleague of mine, Matthew McKissick, said, if you have aphantasia and you want to remind yourself what things look like, one way of doing so is to draw them or paint them.
Yeah.
You can't inspect them in your mind's eye as most of us can.
Great. So yeah, so let's now talk a little bit about some of the artworks in the show. And I wanted to start with just talking about Catherine's work, and she looks a lot at the wave form, at memories of the ocean, and she's created some work which is around dance, but also these sorts of prints. And one of the things I'm interested in her work is about these sorts of states of flow that we get into. And also, with Melissa's work, likewise, she is a paraglider, so she's being moved around by the air, and then she reflects that experience in her artworks and that sense of flow. Yeah, so I guess there's two different aspects for some of the wilderness artists. There's a feeling that you get when you're in nature and you're kind of really immersed in a physical experience, like swimming, like paragliding. And then there's also a very similar sort of experience that some artists have in terms of the way that they develop their processes, that they become immersed in a flow state and a feeling of presence. And I wondered what's happening in the brain in those sorts of states.
Well, I think it's a fascinating question, and my answer is going to be fairly speculative rather than based on large amounts of hard evidence. I think as we were discussing yesterday, the person who originated the concept of flow is a Hungarian psychologist who wrote about creativity with a name that's very difficult to pronounce, but it's something like Csikszentmihalyi. And his concept of flow had to do with our enjoyment of tasks which pose challenges which we are well suited to meeting, but which nevertheless keep us busy. They kind of demand our full attention and our energies, but they're doable. And in the course of doing them, we lose ourselves. And there's something immensely pleasurable for us, I think, about tasks of that kind, which lead to a kind of self-forgetfulness, a kind of creative self-forgetfulness, absorption in the task, which I think probably does have quite a bit in common with the kind of absorption that we can enjoy when we are in nature and we lose ourselves in a walk or in a beautiful place. Now, I guess what is characteristic about both the flow state, the creative flow state, and the flow state when you're immersed in nature, is that you're no longer being distracted by the kinds of stray thoughts which are in most of our minds much of the time bothering us. Thoughts about things that happened yesterday which upset us, or plans for tomorrow. The kind of kinds of thoughts which pop into your mind if you're daydreaming. And there is some evidence that, as the authors of a paper in Science put it, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And we know quite a bit now about the network in the brain which is particularly active when we mind wander. It's a really interesting discovery from the last 15 years or so research in neuroscience that there is a set of regions in the brain which is particularly active if you just lie in a scanner and you chill. And this has been called the default mode network, but it's sometimes called the daydreaming network. And it involves a set of areas which seems to be activated when we recollect the past, anticipate the future, think about other minds. So it's important. We need it. We use it a lot, but it has its downside. It takes us out of the present. It detaches us from the here and now. And so my prediction would be that in flow states, that set of areas is relatively quiet. And I think there is some evidence that happens in meditative states. That in meditative states we kind of can hush this default mode network.
Well, so we're going to be talking about that later.
So a little bit speculative, but I would make another prediction also, which is that I think the pleasure network in the brain will be strongly activated in these states. So that's, I think one of my favorite study in neuroscience in this general area was a study done probably about 10 years ago now by a Canadian neuroscientist who became interested in shivers down the spine. So he was a musician, and he was intrigued by the fact that he and his postdoc both got shivers down the spine from very different kinds of music. She was a rock drummer, I think, and he was an organist. And so they recruited a group of professional musicians and played them passages of music which reliably gave them shivers down the spine. And they were then able to home in on the set of regions in the brain which are active when you get a chill or a shiver. And essentially it's the reward network. It's the set of regions which are active if you eat chocolate or during sex. So regions strongly activated by pleasure. And I think aesthetic pleasure and pleasure of other more physical kinds activates that network, and I'm sure that flow states do too.
That's fascinating, and actually kind of leads me on to my next question, which is about sometimes in nature you get those really sublime encounters, which take you completely away from your everyday life, and Peter has got some amazing images in the show of really extreme environments, and this one, although it's in the Arctic, reminds me of my experience in the Antarctic. And just when you have moments of looking out onto a scene, of not really being able to believe what you're seeing, because it's so unlike anything you have a precedent for. And I have this kind of idea that you know, because we don't see reality as it is, we're kind of predicting reality from our past experiences and memories. That when we see something so totally you know, novel and that we have no precedent for, that sort of the model that we've made somehow falls apart, and for a moment we're just seeing things unknowingly and kind of abstractly, and that's maybe what we're calling sublime. And I just wondered, yeah, what's your thoughts on the sublime encounters in nature?
Yeah, well, let me focus on the idea of prediction, which perhaps before coming to the sublime, I think you're absolutely right that much of the time we're predicting what's about to happen. There's a strong line of thought that is what the brain is doing all the time, that it's a kind of prediction machine, if you like. And it's said that perception is often thought to be outside in, but actually to a great extent it's inside out. Much of what we are perceiving is dependent on predictions that the brain is making to a greater extent than the sensory input that's reaching us. And sometimes it's a bit dull to know what's happening next. So I think it can be very refreshing for us to have an experience of the world defamiliarized. And I think that's one of the things that art does for us, for sure. It forces us to, or it allows us, or it encourages us to stop making predictions, and it encourages us to pay more attention to our senses and to what's happening around and outside us. So I think that's one of the functions of art, one of the reasons that it is enjoyable. And there is a form of artistic experience which has to do with the experience of the sublime, which I guess is a kind of extreme example of defamiliarization. So I think art generally encourages us to pay more attention to the senses, and the experience of the sublime kind of adds a sense of awe to the appreciative attitude that art of every kind induces. There is a study of brain activation by the sublime by Semir Zeki, who's been a great leader in this, in the area of visual neuroscience for a very long time, and who, towards the end of his career, became interested in the neural basis of our experience of beauty. And I reminded myself just before we met that a few years ago he published a paper comparing brain activation by the beautiful versus the sublime, picking up on the distinction which I think the philosopher Burke made originally. And that paper found that actually there are notable differences between brain activity by beautiful scenes versus sublime ones. So this kind of work is really very much in its infancy, but there are some hints that there may be something special about those sublime experiences, which clearly you enjoy, and I guess I'm sure many of us here do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting what you're saying about how artists, they really are focusing on that aspect of problematizing the everyday, like looking at something like a leaf and seeing it anew. And I was really interested in what you were just saying about the sort of almost stages of how we perceive, and you listed it as kind of color, shape, movement, and then we sort of make sense of that. And actually that's yeah, really what I've been trying to do with my work is simplify it to just color and shape, and make it a sort of, I'm trying to make trace those subconscious processes of thought and feelings and emotions. Yeah, so in these works, I've noticed that they've changed a lot from the early works, where it's been really busy, just as you were kind of saying earlier about how you can get very caught up in the everyday, and and past and present and thoughts everywhere. And I've really been trying to quiet that chattering mind, and meditation, as we were talking about earlier, has really been helpful. And this is kind of an example of an early weaving, and then the kind of effect that meditation is having in terms of the ability to to notice thoughts, to have moments without any thought, to have that sort of quieter sense. And it would be great if you could now talk a little bit about what is happening in the mind in meditation.
Yeah, before I do, can you tell us just a little about the contrast between unquiet mind and limbo? I'm interested in, does limbo reflect a more peaceful experience?
Well, no, I thought the unquiet mind was a more peaceful experience.
Okay.
I've called it unquiet. I mean, I've called it unquiet mind because it's still not there yet. There's still a lot of chatter going on inside. But limbo, I think, there was a lot. It was very busy and very intense. Whereas I think, as I've got later, the later weavings, and actually the weavings I've got here in the show, there is a much calmer sense in them, or I've been trying to seek that calmer sense. And the only way I felt that I can achieve that is by changing my mental state.
Yeah. So listening to you talk, I'm kind of reminded about what the Impressionists were trying to achieve, that they wanted to represent visual sensations without being distracted by the process of recognition. And you're sort of it sounds as if you're taking things a step back. You're wanting to represent what's happening in your brain, represent your experience without being distracted, without being distracted by the effort to interpret it. I just wondered do you think there's an analogy there?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. Yeah. And I am trying to, what I'd like to do is give a direct experience of, the feeling of being, which is obviously very difficult to do. And I guess is something I feel maybe even science can't necessarily get us to, is that, subjective experience of being. We'll never know what it feels like to be another being. And so in art, I feel there is an opportunity through language to try and express just what it feels like to be something with thoughts coming and going, with feelings, and without then needing to be the kind of narrative, of our lives.
Yes. So just as a kind of side note, I should say that I'm very interested in what happens in brains, as you'll have gathered, but I don't think for a moment that understanding what happens in brains is ever going to replace the kind of thing that you do. I think they're absolutely complementary. Coming back to the question that you asked originally, which was what happens in the brain when we meditate. So I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's true to say that there have now been quite a few studies, and I think they indicate that the default mode network, which I mentioned, is quietened down in meditative states. So less of the chatter, less of the what happened yesterday, what are my plans for tomorrow, and quite a bit of activity in control regions, executive control regions, which are involved in focusing attention, which I guess makes sense because meditators they train themselves in mind control in a sense, don't they? But the mind control is being used rather unusually to quieten things down.
Thank you. And you talked earlier actually about synesthesia. I'm just going to play a little bit of Geraldine's work. So Geraldine has told me that she is synesthesic. So she basically, when she listens to music, she sees colours and shapes. And I wondered, what is actually happening in those situations where people taste words and smell imagery?
Yeah, well, so there is some evidence for richer connections in synesthetic brains than in normal brains, so that words, for example, activate color areas in a way in which they wouldn't normally do. So the brain's connectivity has been a great focus of interest over the last 20 years or so. The brain contains 100,000 million neurons or so, which are massively interconnected with one another. And differences in brain connectivity are likely to underlie quite a lot of individual differences between us. And it may be that there are some people who have more richly connected brains and others who have less richly connected brains. And I think the leading hypothesis for synesthesia is that it's a hyperconnected state, if you like.
Oh, thank you. I'll just I would also like to hear a little bit about what happens in terms of memory. And one of our artists, Lucy, and I'll just play you a little bit of her work. She basically, she wild swims, but in lockdown hasn't been able to do that. So she set up a pool in her garden to experience her swimming, but whilst also projecting on her past experience. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about our experience of memory, and whether in doing this, Lucy has enriched her experience because of kind of immersing herself physically in a process.
Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to hear from her about how it has affected her memory subjectively. Certainly there's reason to think that it might well enrich her memory. So there is a phenomenon of state-dependent memory. So this was illustrated in a lovely very old psychology experiment now, in which people were taught lists of words either on dry land or in diving bells. So these were divers, and it turns out that you recollect the list you were taught in the diving bell much better when you're in the diving bell than you do when you're on dry land, and vice versa. So if you are surrounded by cues from the environment which was present at the time of learning, that enhances your memory, that boosts your memory. I think we all have some experience of this, don't we? So I have a clinical example in mind. I studied people who have difficulty in recollecting autobiographical events, and one of them, who was a social worker, described an occasion when he was contacted by somebody, remembered nothing about him, then found out that he'd actually worked with him a fair deal, and at the moment he walked into his house, a whole kind of flood of memories came back, because he was surrounded by the cues, he was surrounded by the environment in which he'd had the original experiences. So certainly it would make sense that Lucy's experience would be enriched by engaging in the activity she was engaged in at the time that she had those experiences. What happens in the brain is then very interesting. So there's a broad distinction between what's called semantic memory and episodic memory. So your semantic memory is your memory for facts about the world. So knowing that you went on holiday in France last summer, visited a particular set of places. Your episodic memory has to do with your memory for one-off events. So if you can recollect the day you went to have dinner in a particular restaurant or visited a particular vineyard, that would be an episodic memory. And what is special about episodic memory is that, or about some episodic memories, is that they allow us to re-experience the past. They allow what's been called mental time travel. So you can in some cases kind of replay events if they were particularly important to you often. And that replay involves a kind of imaginative sensation of what happens. So you can visualize, you can remember the taste, you can remember how it sounded like, you can remember the heat of the sun on your skin. Now that is something, of course, that people with aphantasia are unable to do. So that's why I suspect people with aphantasia often feel that they have a less rich autobiographical memory than others. It is now possible to visualize, in another sense, the activity that takes place in the brain when people are revisiting experiences in that way. So when we engage in mental time travel, we use the brain to rerun the kinds of sensations that occurred when we were having the experience for the first time.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you.
And I suspect it seems that that people vary in their kind of mnemonic style. So there are people whose memories are more semantic and others whose memories are more episodic. Some people know a lot of facts about the past, but may find it difficult to re-inhabit experiences from the past. Others may be a bit vague about the facts, but are pretty good at getting inside particular individual memories. So that's an interesting dimension along which people vary, and I think it to some extent probably maps onto the aphantasic hyperphantasic dimension.
Amazing. And so in terms of a theme that was kind of coming out of the show was how we relate to the environment and particularly the weather. So Helen talked a bit about in our opening event about her emotions and how they kind of were influenced by what's happening outside. And obviously it's a beautiful day today, so we're all in high spirits, but it's not always like that. And I wondered, is there any kind of scientific basis for this, or is this something that we learn socially?
That's a really interesting, quite difficult question. I would have thought there is for sure, a biological basis. So I think that the state of your brain in low light on a gloomy Scots afternoon, I'm in Edinburgh at the moment, as opposed to the state of your brain on a day like this when the world is flooded with light, it's going to be very different. So I think there are very direct influences from the environment to the brain. I think that we can often describe our emotions and our states of mind with the help of the environment, using what in literature is sometimes called the pathetic fallacy, so the kind of projection of emotion onto the world. I suspect that there's more to this than simple projection, because as you've suggested, the conditions around us influence our mood, and the idea that our mental states are entirely separate from the world is a rather old-fashioned idea in a way. It's a rather dualistic idea. It suggests that there's a kind of very rigid separation between the human mind and the material world around us. And I think there are plenty of reasons for thinking that there is that picture of the relationship between mind and brain, or mind and matter, is a misleading one, not least because our experience, our emotions depend on a brain which is entirely material.
That's leads me on actually to my next question. So that was very good, which was thinking about Simon basically has looked at these divides that we make, just as you say, between human, non-human, animate, inanimate, and question those and said actually we're all interconnected. And one of the things that I'm intrigued by is where does consciousness lie? How is consciousness created? Is it something that's just in living things, or is there conscious potential in all things? I kind of imagine that you get consciousness from from a kind of assemblage of things with conscious potential, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, so nobody knows. So you're in good company. But there are plenty of theories, and the dominant theory links consciousness to complexity. And if that theory is correct, there is the implication that consciousness, in very small amounts, is present in everything in the universe. And it is when you bring those very small amounts of consciousness together linking them into very complex forms of organization that consciousness can emerge. So that's the integrated information theory of consciousness, which suggests that consciousness emerges in systems which have a combination of modularity and organization. If you, the brain is just like that. The brain has lots of subcomponents which are going about their own business, doing their own jobs, functioning, have the capacity to function independently, but also have the capacity to link together. And it's when you get a complex interlinking of complex components that consciousness arises, or that's what this theory suggests. And the theory has a kind of mathematical formulation, and if you follow through the logic of that mathematical formulation, you can quantify small amounts of consciousness in simple things as well as very complicated ones. So I think it's certainly not a crazy idea that there is consciousness in small elements, small ingredients of the universe.
Oh, that's great. I'm pleased. So this work was something that you, by Caroline, was one that you felt particularly connected to. I wondered if you could say a bit about what drew you to this work when we were looking through them.
Yeah, I liked this. It made me sort of shiver slightly with the cold. I take it it's snowy. Do you agree that is it snowy? I thought there was
landscape of low grasses, but I don't know.
Okay. So I was reading it as a wintry landscape, and it reminded me a bit of the Bruegel print which I had on my wall as a teenager, The Hunters in the Snow, and of other Dutch winter scenes, which always make me feel very cold when I find myself standing in front of them in a gallery. But I think I like its minimalism, and as we discussed, I think there's often a pleasing tension when one's looking at art, which has to do with a kind of simultaneous enjoyment of the scene that's being depicted and of the medium which is being used to depict it, so that you can kind of move between the medium and the message, if you like. You can enjoy the creation of meaning from the materials which are being worked in the composition.
Yeah, and I think Caroline particularly has a focus on collecting her own pigments, making her own inks. I think she makes tools from things she's found in the Thames, and she uses skins as well for some of her to paint on. So there's definitely I think in art generally, but yeah, certainly in her work, a lot of consideration and meaning in the materials that are being used. And I think, as you say, that tension is really interesting that artists try to achieve.
Yeah, it possibly links to the topic we were talking about just before, to how consciousness arises. I think there's a kind of miracle of meaning involved in art. So the ingredients are meaningless, pieces of marble or pigments, but something happens in the hands of a skilled artist which allows meaning to leap from the canvas or kind of shine out from the sculpture, and that's a little bit analogous to the emergence of consciousness from a material body, I think.
Yeah, no, that sounds, that kind of magic that you see in both is definitely, interesting analogy. So I think that was my questions, but Geraldine has very kindly been collecting some questions from some of the people that are watching this evening. So if it's okay, I might just run a couple of extra questions past you. So there we go, we can see you. So one of them was around aphantasia, and whether if people with aphantasia can't visually imagine, do they compensate for that in other ways? Are some of their other senses heightened, or how do they kind of make memories?
So we touched on this earlier, and it's really a really interesting question. So perhaps the first thing to say is that as I mentioned earlier, some people with aphantasia say that they have vivid imagery in other sense modalities than the visual. But there are people with aphantasia, what one might call pure aphantasia, who say they have no sensory imagery at all. For people who do have imagery, that's quite hard to imagine, because so much of our experience has to do with representing things in their absence and using our senses to do so. But these folk get along fine, and they are indeed often imaginative and creative, despite the lack of sensory imagery. And I think the moral must be that there are many ways we can represent things in their absence, some of which are sensory, but some of which are not. And language, of course, is a perfectly good way of representing things in their absence. And we can use words without necessarily being sensitive to their sensory connotations. Now, you ask, or you kind of implied the question of whether there may be strengths associated with aphantasia, and I think there probably are. And it may be that if your mind isn't too cluttered by sensory imagery, it's clearer for other kinds of thinking. And one of the first people to get in touch after we coined the term aphantasia was Craig Venter, who's an American scientist and entrepreneur. He was actually, I think, the first person to decode the human genome, first person to create a novel, to synthesize a novel organism. And he is aphantasic, and said that he'd always reckoned that one source of his scientific prowess was that he had a rather clear mind and was able to think abstractly in ways that others found difficult. So then there may be advantages to representing the world in a relatively sparse and abstract way, which is difficult for people, Claire, like you and many of us, in whom there's a lot of imagery knocking around.
And I guess one thing I'm wondering, and we've got a question about this period of lockdown, and actually we'll still be sensing stuff, but we've not been able to do many of the things that we do usually. So connecting with people physically, we've been moving a lot of stuff to digital. And Laura's asked, how the digital experience affects our consciousness, and whether the kind of digital imagery and our contact digitally, how that compares to our physical experiences of connecting with people.
Yeah, I think we have probably been living rather more in our imagination, haven't we, than we normally would. Certainly, I mean, I've detected in myself a sort of hunger for more varied social contact, which probably most of us have to some extent. Though it's been perfectly survivable. I guess that one linked question has to do with the role of imagery and imagination in our social interactions, and that's another interesting line of inquiry. How important is the ability to share the experiences of others imaginatively in our social lives? And if you lack imagery, is it then more difficult to read the minds of others, for example? That's a possibility which needs to be explored further. I think that our recent experience of lockdown, has caused us to live more in our imaginations than we otherwise would, and has created a kind of hunger for the more direct experience that we can normally enjoy.
I mean, one of the things just on that, having done your study and been in the MRI scanner, it does use digital imagery. That's the reference of what you're seeing and what you're imagining. So I wonder, it would be quite interesting to know the difference between seeing a real person's face in life and seeing the digital imagery. But I guess that'd be quite hard to study in terms of you couldn't necessarily do it in the scanner.
No, you could show films, which people have been using as stimuli in fMRI studies recently. But you're right, and I guess that makes the point that the kinds of science I've been talking about it's still in a way very crude in relation to the richness of our experience, and those bright spots which I show you on scans, those are kind of islands of activity which you detect really after everything interesting has happened. I mean, the brain's moving very fast. Activity in the brain is traveling at great speed, interlinking areas, and we're only beginning to be able to detect and analyze, describe the speed and the complexity of what's happening in the living brain, particularly when it's out and about, as you say.
Yeah, great. And then also we've had a question from Emma about how we perceive colour, and whether there's any ways in which we perceive it physically, or there's sort of colour therapy, whether what your thoughts are on that, because we talked a bit about emotions and how they're linked to weather and stuff.
Yep.
And is there any linkages with colour?
Yeah, well, so just a small anecdote. I used to do my clinics in a hospital in West Lothian, which was actually a lovely place to work, but it had extremely long white corridors. And I worked one very long day there each week. And I remember emerging from the hospital and suddenly seeing color. And it was wonderful. If you emerged and there was a sunlit hillside after a day spent in this entirely white environment. So there's definitely a hunger for color if you're deprived of it. And I'm sure that it does have a big emotional impact. There's a huge science of color. So the way in which the brain processes color is extremely complex and fascinating. It's by no means a simple matter, and I couldn't begin to do justice to it now. But a lot is known about the way in which color perception arises from the processes within the brain. The therapeutic uses of color I'm no expert on, but I think there is some evidence that green environments and blue environments, so natural foliage, views of the sea, are life enhancing and to some extent therapeutic. So
thank you. Great. I've got one more question before we close, which was from Jyoti, and she asked if there is this conscious potential in everything and all things, how does that relate to the idea of intelligence, and I guess also of self-consciousness?
Yeah. So people have distinguished different kinds of consciousness. And I think it's pretty important to do so if you're trying to work out what the underlying biology and science is. So one simple distinction, which I think is quite helpful, is between what's sometimes called core consciousness and extended consciousness. So your core consciousness is kind of moment to moment sensory consciousness, awareness of what's happening inside your body, the sights and sounds around you, the rumbling of your tummy, moment to moment sensory experience. And that's contrasted with extended consciousness, which is the kind of consciousness that is distinctively human, I think, which allows us to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future. That involves the self, consciousness and awareness of the self, in a way that core consciousness does not. And I think it's likely that those two kinds of consciousness have very different bases in the brain. I think core consciousness we very likely share with many other animals, whereas extended consciousness is probably uniquely human. So that's one important distinction, which I think is helpful in thinking about consciousness. How does intelligence fit in? I guess that one simple and maybe slightly misleading answer would be that intelligence is what takes you from core consciousness to extended consciousness. I mean, intelligence has to do with cognition. Cognition is the ability to acquire, store, and use knowledge. We are very cognitive creatures. We're in biological terms very intelligent, and it's our highly developed cognitive skills that have taken us from core consciousness to extended consciousness. But you probably don't need to be very bright to be conscious. So the idea of core consciousness suggests that it's present in creatures who are much less intelligent than we are. And there's a big debate, as we were kind of hinting earlier, about how how far down how far in the animal kingdom consciousness reaches, and whether indeed it reaches outside the animal kingdom, into the inanimate universe.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you, as always.
Thanks very much, Clare.
Thank you. And I guess, like, in terms of some of the things that, I mean, there's been so much that we've covered, but some of the things that kind of come out for me about this is just really recognizing that kind of interconnectedness that we have in the world, that we're not separate from it, that we're all part of an interconnection in the brain as well, that there's all these interconnections which are helping to form these visual images and this sense of consciousness, or the feelings of consciousness. I also think it's really fascinating the way that you've shown us that actually we all have different ways of seeing the world in terms of, you know, actually our physiology and our abilities to imagine, to sense. And I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily be aware of that because you only have your own experience to go by. So you don't know what someone else's experience is like. And I also really like the way that you've talked about art as something which helps to take us away from the everyday, to see things afresh, to kind of refresh our minds, and pay attention. And that's been, yeah, wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for watching and sending in some great questions.
Thanks very much. It's been very enjoyable.
Thank you.